This is the IDP After Show.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the IDP After Show with me, Jase Abbey. Now, unless you and your league mates are absolutely crazy, you'll be about to start your fantasy playoffs, and there's never a more important time to make sure that you get your lineups right. But don't worry, because we have got you covered with the Week 15 IDP preview episode where, as always, we are going to be talking about the defensive players we think can help you win or lose your weekly matchup. And to help me break down what this week's slate of games has in store is the latest in a long line of amazing guests we've had on this year. And in fact, returning for his second appearance on the show this year, as he was so good the first time around, is IDP analyst with fantasy points, Mr. Scott Justin Varnes, aka Down with IDP. Justin, I'm made up to have you back. Welcome to the show again.
Yeah, I love making a second appearance, man. I really love what you guys are doing. I tune in every week as well, take a few notes and try to pass them off as my own to anyone who will listen. So hopefully I can do the same. I mean, week 15, it's playoff time, which means everyone tuning in right now, this is like life or death situation. Trust me, Jason and I are in that same boat as well. Everybody's injured. You know, there's all sorts of chaos going on. So we're going to try and burn through as many of what we think are some highlights and some lowlights, help you prevent some pitfalls and maybe a few people that you might not be thinking as much of. Hopefully going to get you there. But man, I don't know about you, Jase, but for me, this is always so tricky. I mean, as long as we've been doing it, this is still this like life or death thing where it's like you can go into paralysis by analysis by trying to pick the perfect player. You've got a great linebacker or defensive back you've relied on all season, but now it's like life or death. So are you really going to stick with that guy if they've got a bad matchup, whatnot? Talk to me about your thoughts on what to do when it's this time and you've got a great linebacker, but they have a terrible matchup or maybe they're questionable. This is where people really can get themselves in a twist.
Absolutely right. You tend to overthink things to the nth degree. In season, you're kind of like, right, long as this guy's kind of been doing it lately, it's fine. But you get to this point, and as you said, this is when it really matters. Now, I think in general, IDP managers are kind of more inclined at this point to start a stud this week over a guy who, might be considered a bit more of a gamble. And that's definitely the right approach in most cases, right? We harp on about this. We say, like, start your studs. It's slightly more nuanced than that because what defines a stud changes over the course of the season, right? So we kind of have to take into account some of those other factors that, we're going to talk about here. Form, matchup, what's going on with the guys behind them on the depth chart, snap share, all of these things come into it. And I don't think it's as simple as saying start your studs, because who decides what a stud is at this point in the year? We're like 15 weeks in. So what we talked about as being studs at the start of the season may not necessarily be studs now. And when I talk about it being kind of more nuanced, defensive lineman, that's kind of where, for me, I'm kind of sticking with what I've believed for most of this season. There's a few exceptions to that. Linebackers, defensive backs, maybe less so. But yeah, defensive lineman, I guess I kind of stick with my studs more so than at any other position. How about you?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I think that's where people get in the most trouble. And sometimes it comes from previous experience or sometimes it comes from the last couple of weeks. So, there are no greater examples than Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons when it comes to this. Anyone who has used these players this season knows that 2, 3, 4 weeks can go by before something amazing happens. And if those couple of weeks, luckily both of those guys have done well for us. I'm just picking those two because those are two of the more obvious ones. But one, if you've had an edge rusher or defensive lineman who really has been great, and we know they're great players, there's nothing weird about them. But if they've had a couple of bad games, please do not panic. Please start them. I think there was like 2 or 3. I think it might have even been 3 weeks in a row where Myles Garrett just did nothing, and then 3 sacks in the next game and a strip, forced fumble, etc. So one, if you've got that kind of player, and they just haven't been doing it lately, to me, you still have to fire them up. It's so worth the risk, and it is a risk. There's no edge rusher that is not going to be, immune to risk. And Max Crosby went through a slow sack stretch for a while, right? Same thing with Micah Parsons. These sorts of things are just going to happen. And also last year, if you got burned because a defensive lineman lost you the playoffs, as you might see it, you got to shake that off. And finally, I'll say, if Myles Garrett throws up a donut this week and you feel like it's the reason you lost, unfortunately, that's just how it goes. Don't wring yourself to death over this because it just so happened that he threw up a donut. It is going to happen. It's part of the position. It just is. So run them out there. That's all you can do is give it your best shot. So if they've been great and they're great players. And I'm not even worried about matchups when it comes to those guys. I mean, when you're really talking about the elite players, I completely ignore the matchups. You just got to find, because how many times have they delivered when nobody's sacking this quarterback? Well, Micah Parsons can and has. So run them out no matter what. To me, that's my philosophy.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. on that. They are matchup proof. It depends on the league size, and you and I probably do play in those leagues where we're starting 3-4 defensive linemen every week. That might not necessarily be the case for everybody, and that's kind of where it comes back to, right, well, if you've got Parsons, you've got Garrett, you've got all these guys, which of those guys do you start? And we have to be mindful of those people that do play in those leagues, because there are those people. But yeah, for the most part, there's very few people out there that aren't going to be starting one of these studs each week. So yeah, we're in sync on this. So with this in mind, Justin, let's dig into the guys we think can help or hurt IDP managers this week. We've got a lot to get through, right? So we're going to start, though, as we always do on this show, with the linebacker spot. And let's talk about the guy that you like in week 15. Let's hear what you've got for us here.
Well, just in everything we were just talking about, we're obviously going to be skipping the obvious plays in one direction or the other. So for me, it's actually going to be linebacker Nakobe Dean. Zach Bond has had an amazing season. Everybody knows that now. And Dean actually had a pretty slow start to the season. I think everybody was expecting Dean to be this double-digit tackle guy, but it was Bond out of the gate. That threw a lot of us for a loop. And really for the first half of the season, it was a little bit slow. But lately, he has been picking it up. He's got at least 8 tackles in each of his last 4 games, 10-plus tackles in 3 of those 4 games. And the couple of weeks before that, like about 5 or 6 weeks ago, he had a couple of slow games, but I looked carefully. These are absolutely matchup based. He played the inept Jaguars offense, which is terrible for providing linebacker tackles. And then he played a Dallas team that mustered just 44 offensive snaps. And Dean got respectable 6 tackles in those 44 snaps. So those are just oddities that happened back to back. Really a little bit before then and every bit after that, he's been an 8 to 10 or 12 tackle guy. So I love that just across the board that I have shaken off his early season slumber, if you will. He and Zach Bond, they have the best matchup in the league for linebackers this week. They're facing Pittsburgh, and they are the number 1 offense for opposing linebacker production. Remember, both of these guys will get after the quarterback, so you also have some sack upside. But if I've got Nakobe Dean in any league, I'm probably starting him this week. His upside, his ceiling is just too high to not to.
Yeah, and I think that if you've got Bourne or Dean, you're, like you say, you're laughing this week. Really, these guys have been on fire. Bourne, especially. I'm so happy that I've picked him up in the leagues that I have. I was particularly linebacker light in those leagues that I'm talking about, and I was like a Bourne detractor before the season started. I remember chatting in, I think it was in the IDP show chat, and I was like, we're not buying into this, right? This kind of early season or pre-season hype. I was not his biggest fan, but I've come full circle, right? And I think we have to be honest sometimes and just say, look, I just got it plain wrong. I was that guy with Bourne. I didn't see it coming. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. Bourne, Dean, if you've got them, slam dunk starts this week. No complaints.
I mean, I don't think anybody saw Bond come and be, and it's for the reasons I'm sure that you had mentioned. I mean, that kind of role. I mean, first of all, you look at his history, and then you look at essentially the role because he is still playing a good amount of snaps on the defensive line. Like none of that adds up to being somebody you want to draft early in leagues, right? But he's just one of those exceptions that happens every year, and you want to look at it more as a pleasant surprise than to worry about it too much. And yeah, Jase, I totally agree. Like, I don't think any of us should be acting like we know it, and it can be easy to just say like, this was my opinion early on, and I'm going to stick to it and hope that it ends up right. But that doesn't really help anybody. So I always think, yeah, I love being transparent. You can't really brag about the stuff you got right if you don't own up to all the stuff you got wrong. And Lord knows I've gotten a lot wrong this season. Speaking of a player that kind of almost fits that, and to me, he's a lot like Dean in terms of how he started slowly. Tell us about the guy you like this week.
Yeah, so my guy this week is, and I will say, I was close to going with Dean myself. I'm glad I didn't now. I've still got to talk about him because you picked him. But I'm glad I've gone in a different direction. This guy isn't as sure a thing. He hasn't been as good this year, but it's Patrick Queen, right? So, and this choice might surprise, I think. He's had a bit of a, we'd be being generous if we called it anything more than an underwhelming season. All things considered, his tackle efficiency has been mediocre at best. We're looking at a figure, Justin, of 11.7%, which ranks only 77th out of 112 linebackers who have played at least 100 snaps. And, I think for a guy who really made a name for himself in previous seasons as a player who could boost his production with those big plays, right? He had a bunch of sacks, maybe not last year before. I forget what it was, like 7, 8 sacks, something crazy like that. For a guy that's made a name for himself for doing those things, it's a real shame for me that that hasn't been the case for him this year. Is that might have kind of smoothed over some of those real low weeks that we've seen with him. But his lack of, efficiency kind of hasn't been helped, or has been helped, by his availability, right? He's missed only 2 snaps all year, and I can't see that changing this week. Not until the Steelers have wrapped up the division title, which they haven't done so mathematically yet. So, and I think more than that, I think I really like Queen's matchup this week. You talked about Dean having a really nice matchup. The Steelers take on the Eagles, and the Eagles have allowed, I think, more tackles per game, 2 opposition linebackers than any other team in the league. So yeah, there are better options, if I'm honest, than Queen. But yeah, I'd be more inclined to start him this week, I think, than any other week based on that tasty matchup. So yeah, there you go. Justin, look, I mean, he's not the most obvious choice, right, for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning there, but I'm kind of interested to see what you think.
Well, all the reasons, or most of the reasons that I love Dean, I mean, just the matchup. When you have these offenses, like what's great, because these are the same game, right? So when you have these matchups where the opposing offense clearly over the course of the season produce in a certain area more than others, right? I mean, that you can picture an offense that throws that does chunk plays. They throw to the outside the numbers. They have a lot of plays that are generated that way. Well, if you're throwing the ball, 15, 20 yards downfield often, and you're throwing outside the numbers, there aren't going to be any linebackers out there. So of course that kind of offense isn't going to produce a lot. However, if you're running the ball a lot, you're doing a lot of stuff over the middle, a lot of stuff in between the numbers, a lot of screen passes, a lot of halfback dumps, these sorts of things, you're going to build up this extra volume, right? And so like the Ravens, the Steelers, the Eagles, a lot of these offenses are built for that. And that's where these linebackers live. And that's really the important thing here is that sometimes you can take a solid or average linebacker and he'll have production through the roof simply based on an offense attacking his part of the field more often than not. And I think that's what you see here. And I totally agree. I mean, these are probably the 2 best matchups of the week. Queen has befuddled us all this year, but he has produced in good matchups, and this is certainly one of them, I think. And clearly the Eagles offense should be able to stay on the field as strong as the Steelers defense is, and it is. And by the way, that's also part of it, right? and we've seen this with Fred Warner. Fred Warner will have mediocre tackle statistics. And you think, oh man, that's, like what's going on with him? Well, his offense stays on the field a lot and his defense gets off the field quickly. So, he for the last couple of years, he was averaging like 50 something snaps a game. That's a solid 15, 20 lower than a lot of other people. So, but this will be a game where the Steelers defense, I think, will be on the field more often than not. So all these things lead toward, and I like Queen and Dean. These are the sorts of players where if you end up, you have a linebacker you've been using and they're injured, or they end up being inactive, or there's some situations like that. These are the kind of guys you want to fill in. Or if you're playing 3 or 4 deep and one of these guys are on your bench, it's time to move them up.
Absolutely. Especially after what we've seen in recent weeks with the plethora of injuries at the linebacker spot. Just last week, what was the Titans, the Bucks, their linebacker starters were almost unrecognizable. Otis Reese, the fourth. I love it.
Yeah, he's supposed to be fourth string. That's what it means. That's what it means by the fourth. He's not supposed to be a starter.
I like it. So, look, tell us which linebacker you're fading this week. Who don't you like?
Well, this is a tough one for those of us who grabbed this guy and expected him to be this strong playoff push guy for us, and that's the Buffalo Bills' Matt Milano. He was once one of the best coverage linebackers in the league, and a no doubt 3-down linebacker. Played for the Bills, but his post-injury return has not really been what we were hoping for. He's basically been a 2-down linebacker, and it's only been a couple of games, but after a couple of games, if he still isn't, if they're clearly still pulling him off the field in 3rd and long situations, he's playing about 80% of the time. That's not terrible, but in his 80% of the snaps, his tackle efficiency has been really poor. Maybe this injury is has really sapped some power or some speed or some quick twitch from him, but he just doesn't seem like the same player. And again, chances are you grabbed Milano either early in the season and just threw him on your IR, or you grabbed him a couple of weeks before he came out, hoping you'd have the old Matt Milano for your playoff push. But based on the numbers and based on what I've seen, I'm certainly no tape expert, but just from the naked eye, just seeing Matt Milano, it just doesn't look like the same player. It's just somebody I really can't trust this week, which really stinks because I've been a Matt Milano fan for a long time. But you just this is one of those ones where I just can't fire him up this week.
I hear you, but let me play devil's advocate for a minute, right? So, he is taking a little bit of time to get back. His snap share did grow a little bit last week. 84% is quite a healthy number. We have got a bunch of injuries at linebacker. People might be scrabbling around this week a little bit, maybe not as much as last week with 6 teams on a bye. And that matchup is not bad this week. Is there a chance that 3 weeks in, he's knocked a bit of rust off, we get a little bit of the old Milano this week?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. Hopefully, what we've seen is just a slow getting him back up to speed. And I want to be clear. Normally, Matt Milano is the ideal LB2, right? And so I can't use him as an LB2. However, if I'm playing 3 or 4 linebackers, I have no problem using Milano as one of my 4 linebackers. I mean, he's, like you said, and we're talking about an 80% snap share, even if he stays there, Jase. I mean, we're not talking about somebody who's coming off the field 40% of the time. He's coming off 15% of the time. That's not bad. You're right. If you're struggling for options and you're playing 3 or 4 linebackers, I'm fine to use Milano, but I'm expecting, maybe a better way to say it is, I'm expecting 6 to 8 tackles, as opposed to the 8 to 10 or 12 that you might have been hoping you were going to get heading into the playoffs once Milano was up to speed.
Yeah. And what's interesting with Milano is, going back to one of your earlier points, he doesn't look the same player yet. We don't expect him to, this early on. He's missed all year, but what I thought was interesting was that if he hadn't missed the amount of tackles he'd missed in the last 2 games, he would be at those figures that you were just talking about.
Right.
In week 13, San Fran, he'd have had 8 tackles. Last week against LA, he'd have had 6 tackles, and those are decent numbers. And I know everybody misses tackles, And Milano's no different, but the rate he's been missing tackles at in those last 2 games have hurt his bottom line a little bit. And maybe it's, as I say, knocking off the rust. But I don't disagree with the point you made that he doesn't look the same player. I'm just kind of interested, and I'm intrigued to see whether or not this is as I say, just like dusting himself down after being off the field for a little bit, and he's ready to go this week in what is, like I say, actually not a bad matchup. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I like that.
So who
do you have?
Yeah, I've gone with Devondre Campbell with my week 15 fade, and I wasn't going to mention him. As is, I don't want to mention the obvious players here, so I don't think many people were starting him prior to this week. But I wasn't going to mention him because he's been kind of below average all year. But he put out 9 tackles last week, and after seeing his roster ownership increase as a result, I'm sat there thinking, right, what are people doing? What are they thinking? I saw him picked up on waivers in a couple of leagues as well this week, and I felt it's if there's any time to warn people off of him, it's week 15, right, just before the playoffs. The main reason, obviously, you all know this already, is his diminishing involvement in that defense. He's played every down pretty much between weeks 8 and 11. In fact, did play every down in between those weeks. But then he was at 93% in week 12, 71% in week 13. Last week, season low 64% against the Bears. Now, I know there was he and Warner came off right towards the end. It was, they kind of rested both guys, but Campbell came off before it got to that point. D. Winters has kind of been eating into his role a little bit, and there's a possibility of Dre Greenlaw returning as well. So for me, there's several reasons. I don't actually care about his matchup. At this point, there's so many red flags with him that there's no way I'd be starting him. I don't think anybody should be starting him. I'm very confident in this one.
Yeah, I mean, Winters played 51% of the snaps, so he's we've seen this kind of build up. Yeah, particularly, I mean, if there's any chance that Greenlaw is coming back, who I think we just talked about this with Milano. Injuries can these coaches see what we don't see, right? They see these guys in practice, they have a good feel, but if Greenlaw is remotely the same player, they're going to want to get him involved, and it's too much traffic, right? I mean, I don't think the San Francisco 49ers want Devondre Campbell on the field very much, right? This is more necessity, and particularly as D. Winters kind of comes together. But you're going to, we talked about the risks. You're going to take risks with your defensive linemen. That's just the nature of that position. You are going to take risks with your cornerbacks. That's the nature of that position. You really want to try to avoid taking risks at the linebacker because, the way the roster construction is supposed to work is you're supposed to have these linebackers and safeties, and maybe you spent early on a Max Crosby and whatnot, who has a high tackle floor, but you want this solid base of production so that the ups and downs of your riskier options like defensive ends and cornerbacks, they can ebb and flow, and it doesn't necessarily kill you where your entire roster production from the defensive side is ebbing and flowing, right? So you need some meat in the middle, if you will. So this is certainly not a position where I want to be taking a shot and just hoping that what we've seen from Devondre Campbell is a fluke. Is there a chance he's going to play 100% of the snaps this week? Of course there is, but it's too risky. Yeah, and it's a way riskier than Matt Milano. But Jason and I are basically saying a similar thing in look, if you've got somebody who is playing 100% of the snaps, has a solid matchup, maybe they're not as big of a name or whatever, don't overthink that. Take your expected solid 7 to 9 tackles from a solid LB2 or 3. Do not take the risk here because Campbell I think he had 6 or 7 tackles last week, and on paper, if you don't look at the snap count, you think, oh cool, that's a little on the low side, but that's not bad. I'll fire him up this week. That's dangerous territory.
Yeah, and going back to why would they start him? Right. They've got a younger guy who's been kind of promising. They've got another guy coming back who they kind of, appreciate he's a pending free agent. But why would you start this older linebacker? They already know what he's got. They're not in the playoff hunt. There's nothing to be gained from it, I don't think.
I agree.
Maybe that's just me. Anyway, look. So we got linebackers in the books. Let's turn our attention to the defensive line. Which edge rusher or DT do you think can deliver in Week 15?
I really like Chop Robinson this week. First of all, he's put up really strong peripherals lately, and he's got 3.5 sacks in his last 6 games. That's not amazing production, but it's certainly better than he was doing earlier in the season. We've seen this time and time again with. I'm forever preaching, as a lot of people are, about patience with these younger defensive linemen across the board, across the entire defensive line. It takes a lot for these younger players to finally get up to speed. As I always say, these veteran O linemen, they've seen every pass rush move you've got. They're 6 years older. They've spent that much more time in the weight room. You're not going to impress them. It does take a lot, but eventually those defensive linemen start to pick up the pace. And I think we're seeing that more and more from Chop Robinson. So I like his arrow pointing up, but really it's about the matchup here, because the Texans have had a really tough time keeping CJ Stroud upright. It seems to be a combination of surprisingly bad O-line when you consider Larry Tunsil, et cetera, at pass blocking. They've been much better at run blocking, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But Stroud has taken 41 sacks on the season. That's second most. So just enjoy it from that part of the matchup. And to that last point, I also really like Emmanuel Ogbah this week. I think Ogbah might be a little bit more of an obvious choice, so I went with Robinson, who might on paper might look like an up and down season, but I think I've seen improvement. So now back to the fact that the Texans are run blocking better. They've been running the ball a little bit more, and that actually has helped both of these guys tackle floor, right? So we definitely want those shots at Stroud when we can get them, but we'd also like to have some extra tackle opportunity, maybe get 2, 3, 4 tackles, hopefully get a sack or a half a sack, something like that. I could see that absolutely happening this game. But really this is about going after CJ Stroud, who, like I said, is the second highest sacked quarterback. However, there is somebody who's been sacked more times. Is that right, Jase?
There is. Caleb Williams, man. What's left to say at this point? We often talk about how QB sacks, or that defensive lineman sacks, are a QB stat, and I don't think it's as clear cut as that, obviously. And I know that there's people that are saying that, and I probably said it myself, don't mean that it's only the QB that's responsible for those sacks. We know it's a combination of things. But man, when I'm looking at a guy like last week, I sounded like Chris Collinsworth there, didn't I? Here's a guy that pressured 9 times, but was sacked 7 times. Right. And that's kind of consistent with what we've seen all year. So I'm going to talk about Jonathan Greenard and Andrew Van Ginkel, right? So they've both been really good all year. Both are knocking on the door of double-digit sacks. Greenard is actually, this surprised me a little bit, second only to Hendrickson with 60 pressures this year. Now, I know neither guy has done very much in the last 2 games. In fact, neither of them got sacks since, I think it's week 12. That kind of adds up, doesn't it? But I think this is the matchup where it's going to change, right? The Bears are allowing fewer quarterback pressures than they were, maybe a month or so back when you look at the stats. But like I say, Williams just hasn't learned how to evade what pressure does come his way. 9 pressures, 7 sacks. It tells its own story, doesn't it? Yeah. He's now been sacked a league worst 55 times this year. And your guy, CJ Stroud, is amongst 3 guys, Geno Smith, Joe Burrow as well. They've all faced more pressure, but Williams has been sacked 14 times more than any of them, which again tells its own story. So on that basis, Justin, if Greenard or AVG don't have a big game this week, I would be very surprised.
Yeah, same here. And, as we were talking earlier, neither of these guys have put up much lately, but the peripherals are there. These are both great players. It's also just not only does Williams, obviously, it's great when the offensive line is giving up pressures, and when the quarterback can't evade those pressures. You're almost like doubling your odds there that he's going to go down. And if this game plays out the way people think it will, you can picture the second half of this game being a situation where Williams is going to have to scramble and try and make things happen, get his receivers downfield a little, give them a little bit more time to try and play catch up if indeed this game goes that way. So all those arrows are pointing in the right direction. And that's all you can really do for your defensive lineman that you're sending out there. It's, you're just dealing with chance. So you want to stack those odds in your favor. And across the board, this really looks to be about as good a position you can get into. And again, we're mentioning guys who are middle of the road edge rushers that you probably have in your lineup, and they've, maybe they're on your bench or maybe they're a DL3. But to me, these matchups are too good to pass up. Not to pass up over a great pass rusher. Don't overthink that, as we were talking about earlier. But if you're struggling, or if they're injured, or again, if you're playing in 2 or 3 or 4 defensive linemen, I'm certainly starting these guys.
Yeah, 2 points to add to that. So interestingly, I'm in 1 or 2 leagues where AVG and Greenard are both top 10 edge guys, and I'm in other leagues where neither of them is in the top 24. And I guess it comes back to your scoring system. But the other point I wanted to add was the other guy I wanted to consider, and I want to talk about him very briefly. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here. Was Odafe Oweh, and the reason for that is, did you see the Giants game last week? Drew Lock is something else. I forget how many. I didn't make a note of it because I wasn't intending on talking about it. I remember looking at the amount of times he was pressured last week, and it was, it was apparent when you watched it. When you look back at the stats afterwards, it's like, oh God, something like 20. I'm going to look it up now while we're on. I've got to. It's something really special. Bear with me. This is like really not good to do this in the moment, but it has to be spoken about. 26 times.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's incredible.
26
but you could
times.
just watch him run around back there trying to make things happen. He didn't seem at all settled in the pocket. So, and it really is, to me, it's a combination there, right? Like he's almost, it's not quite Caleb Williams-esque, but if you've got an O-line that's not blocking well, and you've got a quarterback who just is running for his life, this Giants offensive line, I'm going to say something pretty obvious here, but it's important to kind of keep in mind when you have a ridiculous left tackle who you can set on an island and who can, do quite a lot there, then you really can put all of your energy toward chipping and protections and stuff for the almost one half of your offensive line. But the Giants had one of the best, in my opinion, he's top 2, if not top 1, and that was Andrew Thomas. The guy's just last year I put up a picture of a brick wall. I was like, hey, I saw Andrew Thomas today. But he, ever since he's been out, it just changes everything, changes the protections. They can't just, assume that side's on lockdown, and man, are we seeing a lot of that. So now we've got a quarterback who's trying to find his way, and a team that's a little bit in disarray. I like that call as well. We're just looking for these opportunities where these quarterbacks are you've got a higher chance with the quarterback. You got a higher chance with the offensive line and a higher chance with the game script. We're stacking all of those together. This is another good example of that.
Yeah. What put me off Oweh a little bit was the really small snap share he had a couple of weeks back, and that it was surprising. And I think I saw something about how they said he was like Tavius Robinson was favored because Robinson's a better run defender. No, Oweh's not a bad run defender. Not to my mind anyway. So that kind of put me off a little bit, as did this idea that Locke is that heel injury, he might not start. But that last point put me off to a lesser extent, because it's not like DeVito wasn't pressured like hell in the one game he had, or that Daniel Jones really struggled at times as well. Like you say, they're missing some key players on that offensive line, so they're a good team to target. But I'm really intrigued to see what happens with Oweh's snap share, because he's not played badly this year, far from it. And I think this would be the ideal matchup. I might have even mentioned him if that wasn't for that massive snap decrease that we saw in week 13. But yeah, if you've got him and you're desperate for some defensive line help, then I would like to think that his involvement is going to be a lot higher than it was a couple of weeks back. So
yeah, I agree.
Let's watch this space. So DL dislikes. What have you got for me?
Oh man, this one, it's not really a dislike. It's, I know that was the assignment, but
I knew that was going to be the case, and I was just being a knob. I just been a bit of a dick.
I mean, look, that was the assignment. The assignment was a dislike, and I love both of these players, but we have a little bit of an issue. It's like, this is an embarrassment of riches, but it can be tricky. This is not a sit recommendation as much as it is a warning, and then you can look at your own roster construction and decide if you want to take this risk, or just even go in to your matchup understanding the risk. And so what do you do when you have three great pass rushers, and one of them is a perennial Pro Bowler, probably going to be in Hall of Fame? You can't play all three of them all the time, and this is what's happening with the Steelers. Alex Highsmith, who's having a great season, got banged up, and then they brought in Nick Herbig, and Herbig tore it up. Now, I will say this: I always try to mention this. Whoever is playing opposite T.J. Watt is going to have a breeze of a time. That's just, and that, so this is something to always take advantage of. If you've got a great pass rusher on one side, chances are somebody's going to get more free looks, or somebody on this other side is going to get more one-on-one looks. And both of these guys are. It just so happens that they're also talented enough to take advantage of them. So last week, so Highsmith is back, but they're essentially, Highsmith and Herbig are rotating now. Because there are some packages where you can get all three of them, these like NASCAR packages kind of things where you can get all three of them on the field at once. But in general, I'm not sure you're going to see either of these players on the field for 70, 80% of the snaps. I'm not worried about Watt. It's only these other two. So there's just some risk involved, because the reality is we don't really know how many snaps either of these players are going to get. Are they going to split them? Was this just like a little bit of a warm-up game for Highsmith, and Highsmith's going to completely take over? I don't think so, because Herbig really does play well. But if you're expecting a high snap share from either of these players, just be forewarned. I think the risk of lowered production for both of these is a lot higher than maybe we were hoping for. But again, we're not worried about TJ Watt. I'm going to start him if he's got one working arm and suffering from the black lung. Yeah. So this isn't a TJ Watt conversation. How do you think this is going to shake out between these two?
Yeah, I couldn't wait to see how that division of snaps was going to look when Highsmith came back. And to reiterate a point that you made there, it is key that we do remember this was Highsmith's first game back. But Herbig, like you say, has been on fire. The underlying metrics support it. The box, the box score suggests it too. He's been getting home as well. It's not just a case of us saying, his win rate's great, pressure rate's great. He's actually been getting home as well. He's been getting those sacks. Why would you not give him more of an opportunity than he was getting earlier in the year, when he's proven so far in a smaller sample size, at least, that he can be as impactful as someone as good as Alex Highsmith, right? So I've got to say, I probably wouldn't do anything different this week if I was in charge of that, and God help us if I was in charge of that Steelers defense, right? So he's that good so far, Herbig, and he deserves his shot. Will it look any different this week? I don't know. I don't think it's going to look vastly different than how it looked last week.
That's what I think.
A hell of a lot of Watt, quite a lot of Highsmith, and to a lesser extent a bit of Herbig, but enough of Herbig to hurt Highsmith. That's just how it is.
If I'm starting either of these, I'm starting Highsmith. But it's a little worried. I'm not as confident as I was hoping to be.
No, absolutely not. What's wrong with Preston Smith? Why is he not being talked about here?
Preston.
I joke. I jest. Yeah, he's got to be looking at those three guys around him and thinking,
I know, just like,
what have I done? Why am I joining this team?
yeah, why am I here? Right.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm right there with you on that. I really like Herbig, and I really like Highsmith, and it hurts me because I've got a bunch of Highsmith in a bunch of places. He was playing, 70-80% of snaps. He was one of those guys who took a little while to get going, but once he did get going, he was, he's starting to really come into his own. A little bit like Jermaine Johnson for me as well. Real shame to see his snap share deteriorate, but it is what it is. We've got to roll with it. We've got to call it out as you've done here. It just hurts that it's happening in time for the playoffs.
Yeah.
So I don't like picking guys who I think are good either, but I couldn't avoid mentioning this guy this week. Greg Rousseau is my mention in this spot, and I've got to say I would love to see him push on and hit that sort of double-digit sack mark that he's kind of been flirting with for what seems like 3 or 4 years now. And if he can continue to produce at like a 13.7% pressure rate, which incidentally is his pressure rate so far this year, he has a really good shot of getting there. That ranks just in 21st out of 115 edge rushers. So again, he's really good, right? But outside of the easier matchups he's faced this year, and this is something I have to really mention, the Titans, the Texans, the Chiefs, these are teams who have all really struggled to protect their quarterback, and surprisingly so with the Chiefs, because that wasn't who they've been in years past, even with poor O-line play. Outside of those games, Rousseau's kind of struggled to remain at least consistently productive. So this is where this matchup comes into play for me, and this is where it becomes a bit of an issue, because the Lions aren't an easy matchup by any imagination. They're tied with two other teams. I forget who those two other teams are in allowing the least sacks all year. And even when they be missing guys like Taylor Decker, they've got guys like Dan Skipper who've kind of come in and held their own, right? Better than most backups can at least. So I think there's a chance they get Decker back this week, or at least there was last time I looked. But even if they don't, I'm just not loving Rousseau's matchup in this one. And if I had to call out any of my nominations that I'm perhaps less confident in than some of the other ones, it is this one, because I do acknowledge that Rousseau's good. I do like him. It's purely a matchup-based thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna if you have Greg Rousseau and you're nervous about starting him, but you have to start him, I'm gonna try and bring a little rainbow and sunshine to this conversation. I totally agree. Rousseau's chances of getting a sack are very low this week for all the reasons you mentioned. And one more reason, I mean, part of the reasons these numbers look so good, I mean, obviously Detroit has a great offensive line, and what I'm about to say isn't a knock on their line at all, but if you run the ball as much as the Detroit Lions do, you're not going to have as many opportunities for the opposing players to get sacks. And I mean, they run over 50% of the time. They've got two obviously amazing running backs that they can just cycle through, just keep giving them breaks. They can just run on you all day long. And and it doesn't seem to matter the matchup. Or you think of the Bills, they're, a high-powered offense. The Lions don't seem to care too much. They're just going to keep running and doing their thing. So Rousseau's chances for getting a sack are much lower. However, Rousseau's chances of having a decent tackle day are about as good as you can get. The Lions, I think, are second most in terms of creating tackles to defensive linemen. Now, obviously, edge rushers sometimes can get the smaller share of that, but Rousseau has hit at least four tackles. In 7 games so far this season. He's hit, I think, 7 tackles one time. So if you've got to use Rousseau, I'm not expecting sacks, but he could end up with 3, 4, 5 tackles, and that might get the job done for you. So I don't see him getting 2 sacks this week. I don't even see him getting 1, but he still might be okay for you if he gets 3 or 4 tackles.
Yeah, this is a good point, and I'm glad you've called me out on that one. There are those leagues where tackles do matter more than sacks, and tackles at least matter in every league. But there's certain leagues where they are a bit more tackle heavy with the scoring than some of the other leagues. The majority of leagues that I'm in, where sacks are king. So yeah, you're right to mention it, and we're giving those good people out there all the information they possibly need from every angle. So appreciate that. look, it's time to talk DBs now. Which player do you like at the position this week, and why?
Well, I'm going to mention somebody who is should be somebody you're already starting, but DBs can be very volatile. So I'm just driving this point home, and that's Raiders safety Tre'von Moehrig. He's once predominantly a deep safety on this team back when they had, I just blanked on Jonathan's last name, Jonathan Abram. With Jonathan Abram, who's really basically a glorified linebacker, right? They had to play Moehrig as their deep safety, but he's been used way more in the box this season, and we've seen a lot of really good production from him in that role. But this is also more about the matchup. He's got a stellar matchup this week. He's facing the Falcons, who produce over 30 tackles to defensive backs. I think they're going to continue to throw it a lot, and Moehrig will also be there near the box when they start leaning heavily on Bijan Robinson. So if you've got Moehrig, I'm firing him up this week. I think he's just got too good of a matchup to leave behind.
Yep, and with him, we're looking at career year for tackle numbers, career year for sacks. He's got a good chance to put up a career year in interceptions and pass breakups as well. There's a lot to like. And like you say, the matchup, I'm all in.
Yeah.
I'm all in. So
who do you have?
Yeah, I am loving me Quentin Lake this week. And obviously he's been one of the best DBs in fantasy all year. His tackling rate's at almost 11%, which is really nice for a safety. 19th out of 112 in that category. Hasn't missed a snap all year. And while he's coming off one of his least productive performances, he had only like 3 tackles against the Bills. I'm not put off in the slightest, partly because we know, as we talked about at the top of the show, not to panic after 1 or 2 unproductive performances, especially from DBs, right? They're very volatile. But also partly because his matchup for the 49ers just couldn't be any better. They allow extremely high tackle efficiency to opposition safeties. So I'm assuming, going back to a point we were making with another player maybe 5-10 minutes ago, the 49ers offense can stay on the field enough to keep Lake and the Rams defense on the field quite a lot. So I think he's in a great spot to continue doing what he's been doing most of the year, at least. Now, before I wrap up on this one, I do have to give props to, I think it's Bobby. He was one of the few to predict big things for Lake in 2024. I didn't see it coming at all, much like I didn't see it coming with Bourne, we talked about earlier on. Did you, Justin? Did you see this being a big year for Lake?
No, I mean, we got like hints of it, but not really. And every year we get a player like this, who always with DBs, and it's these secondaries coaches or the defensive coordinator who like finds a player and they start putting them in a position. Lake plays a lot of snaps in the slot and in the box, and also you can just. We didn't see it coming, that's for sure. But as soon as you start watching him and you see how this defense runs, you will find these players who almost are like, I remember this like with Rashad Jones back with the Dolphins and the earlier years of Harrison Smith, where it's just like every single play, you just out of the, I'll just talk about Harrison Smith. It's like every single play you're watching the telecast, and as soon as it starts, you just see this purple missile with number 22 on his back. No matter where the play is, he just is shot out of a cannon heading straight for the ball carrier. Even if he doesn't get there, even if he doesn't get the tackle, he just is always there in, almost getting there in time, if not getting there in time. And that's what we've seen in Lake. I mean, whatever they've done, they put him in a great position to either be free enough of responsibility to just play a lot of run fit, and just not have a whole lot of man coverage situations. It's just been great to see. And you want to talk about this is how often we preach like, if I could just not draft a DB at all and then just wait to see who's going to be Quentin Lake this year. He's probably the greatest example this year of that type of player. Julian Love, we saw that last year with the Giants, the same sort of thing. You just wait, and this player just shows up, and there's usually more than one. But Love, like, Man, he's been great all season. So, and yeah, a great matchup. He didn't have a great matchup last week, so that wasn't terribly surprising, but definitely a great matchup this week.
For sure, for sure. Okay, let's talk about the DBs we should be avoiding in week 15. Who you got for us, Justin?
Well, I'm going to talk about a guy who's been on the rise lately, but it's the reason I want to bring him back up because he just has such a bad matchup this week, and that's Jordan Battle of the Bengals. He's been in a weeks-long battle, if you will, with for the starting safety job in Cincinnati with Von Bell. He seemingly has won that and is playing well over Bell, but number one, he's not playing every snap. Von Bell is still getting on the field, so Battle doesn't have that every down spot that we really want. But also, no team creates fewer safety tackles than the Tennessee Titans. They're averaging 9 tackles for entire safety units this season. That is just poor. They're hoping to get Will Levis back this week, the Titans are, but remember, he's the one who generated these poor numbers, so his status really has no bearing on this. I don't like Battle this week. With fewer snaps and a terrible matchup, he's just a guy I've got to avoid.
Yeah, and that, again, this is one that pains me to agree with because, I've got a bunch of him. Really nice to see him earn that role, though. I think if you have a league which starts maybe like 4 DBs, you could find a way to justify starting him as your 4th DB, but it's not like we're scraping the bottom of the barrel to find DBs. There's a whole bunch of them relative to other positions. We're kind of spoiled for choice, so yeah, I like that choice. Now I am rounding out my nominations for week 15 with a guy that I'm going to be swerving at all costs, and it's Chuck Clark. 7 tackles, nice production from him last week, but he had to be extremely efficient as a tackler to hit that number. He did play 58 snaps, which seems okay at first glance. That's a decent number of snaps in a game week for a defensive player, for any player. But the Jets used Jalen Mills, Tony Adams, and others, meaning Clark only had like an 81% snap share. If that's not enough of a reason not to use him, the Jets play the Jaguars this weekend. The Jags have been one of, if not the worst matchups for opposition safeties in terms of tackle numbers. So with that said, I think it would be completely foolish to expect a repeat performance from Clark this week. That situation with those Jets safeties is just horrible for fantasy. And if you're not benching him already, then please do so. And then just come back and blame me if he does blow up and have a massive week. So with that said, that kind of does it for our week 15 nominations. Let's do a quick recap of the guys we talked about, though. So Justin's likes for week 15 were Nakobe Dean, Chop Robinson, and Tre'von Moehrig. Mine were Patrick Queen, the combo of Jonathan Greenard and AVG, and then Quentin Lake. Justin's fades were Matt Milano, the combo of Alec Highsmith and Nick Herbig, along with Jordan Battle, while mine were Devondre Campbell, Greg Rousseau, and Chuck Clark. I think, and I said something similar last week, I'm biased, but I think that's a good-looking list right there. The Rousseau selection is probably the one that could come back to bite me, as Justin and I talked about, because, as I said earlier, he is a good player. He can be disruptive. And as Justin pointed out, quite rightfully, or quite rightly, he could generate good tackle numbers. But yeah, I kind of stand by that and all of my choices, and I can't wait to see how it plays out. But before we wrap things up, Justin, you've smashed it. You did it back in week 4. Really good to have you back again. If anybody in our audience is still not following you and your content, please tell them where they can go to find it and how good it is. Just sell it for us, please.
My pleasure. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at DownWithIDP. That's the best place to come find me. Obviously, I'm on the IDP show from time to time. And also my main job is over at fantasypoints.com, where I'm doing a lot of the IDP stuff there, as well as some defensive bets. But find me on Twitter. That's the easiest way, at DownWithIDP.
Good stuff. Please go and check out Justin's work. If it's not already obvious, like I say, this is his second stellar performance on this show, then he is as good as it gets. And let's face it, we all need as much help as we can get at this point in the fantasy calendar. And with that said, yeah, all that's left to do is for me to thank our audience, remind you guys to subscribe to our channels on all of your favorite platforms, and to wish you all the very best of luck in the playoffs. This has been the IDP preview episode on the IDP After Show, and I'll catch you again next week.
This was the IDP After Show.